And we're live. It is Wednesday, May 25th, 2022, 5:01 p.m. The Michael Sussman trial continues, and I continue to be 48 hours behind in it reading the transcripts. It continues to be incredibly boring. I have a request and a favor for all of you. I was just notified that the podcast Allies, which we have now produced 3 episodes of, and I am sharing in the the chat, is now in the top 100 on Apple Podcasts. And
Wow.
so the Goat Rodeo people asked me to ask each and every one of you to rate and review it. You can watch it, listen to it later, and validate your review, change it if you need to. But for now, just go rate and review it. And if you haven't actually listened to it yet, just use words like awesome or fabulous. I'll even tell you what it's about.
Can't
Um,
miss.
it is about, yeah, so that you can say this is the best podcast I've ever heard about the translators and interpreters who the U.S. worked with in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly Afghanistan, and the special immigrant visa program that was set up to prevent us from leaving them behind, and why that program kind of didn't work, and we left a lot of people behind. So check it out, listen to it. But even if you don't listen to it, rate and review it. There are 75 of you right now on here. Right now, we have 35 ratings or reviews. So I by the end of this show, I want to see like 100 ratings on there. Look, we are not allowed to have fun anymore, but I think the people of Taiwan are kind of allowed to have a little bit of fun, because all of a sudden, the president of the United States the other day, in response seemingly to a reporter's question, seemed to change 40 years of US policy and asked whether the United States would militarily defend Taiwan, answered with a simple 3-letter word that rhymes with guess, which would have been the traditional answer. He did the 3-letter word that rhymes with guess, that seems to abandon the policy of strategic ambiguity. The White House raced to say that yes does not mean yes, which is different from no does not mean no. Yes does not mean yes. Yes means guess, which is to say we have not abandoned strategic ambiguity. But I gotta say, I listened to the president's comments several times, and if I were Xi Jinping, I wouldn't care what Jake Sullivan said on background after it. It sure sounded like the president said he would defend Taiwan. In the context of the US operations with respect to Ukraine, this struck me as significant, seems to be striking a lot of people as significant. And I thought to myself, who would I want to chat with about this? And I said, Julian Ku, who I can't remember, Julian, if you've ever been on In Lieu of Fun. I know you've been on Lawfare Live, which is kind
No,
of
it's my first
similar.
time. It's my
Well,
first time. I
welcome.
can't believe you do this every day. I don't understand how you
Yeah,
do this. But
so we're down
Welcome.
to 3 days a week now. So
okay.
welcome to the show, and get us started. What To what extent was what Biden said a departure, and to what extent was it a aggressive restatement of longstanding U.S. policy?
Okay. So yeah, this is a great example of where a policy is so complicated and big that it's very hard to pin anyone down on whether they're actually violating it, right? Or whether they've changed it. And it's even weirder when it's the president of the United States whose comments are doing this. So it's a great case study in how foreign policy is made by the U.S. And or not made, and how confusing it is. So I think that the policy is really flows back to what is the U.S. obligation or attitude toward a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, right? That's the narrow, but it's part of a bigger question of what is the U.S. position on what Taiwan is, whether it's a country or not, and they're related. And for China, they're kind of the same thing. So for China, says there's a one China principle, Taiwan's part of China, we're done. And so therefore, there's no question the U.S. would defend Taiwan because it's part of China. The U.S. position is ambiguous on several levels. It's ambiguous as to whether the U.S. thinks Taiwan is part of China. It's ambiguous as to whether the U.S. would actually defend Taiwan if it was invaded by China. It was also ambiguous on what conditions, which type of situation the U.S. would defend it. So it might defend it in some circumstances, but it might not defend it in others. And so Biden, I think, his statement, I think you're right, Ben, especially given the question and the context, and contrasting it to the U.S. response to Ukraine, which is to send weapons but not intervene militarily. The way he answered it can't really be interpreted any other way than saying, actually, this time we would actually intervene militarily because we already send and sell lots of weapons to Taiwan. So we're already doing for Taiwan what we are currently doing for Ukraine. So there would be no reason to answer that question the way he did, unless he meant to say that we would actually use U.S. forces to defend Taiwan. And so the U.S. has never, the president of the United States has never, until President Biden, explicitly ever answered that question with yes. And not only that, he's done this
much
now
less
3 times.
Yes, stop. Right? It's not yes, we urge both sides to resolve this peacefully, and the
Right.
disposition, we want everyone to behave with restraint in the Taiwan Straits, right? There's yes plus verbiage. This was just yes.
Yes, and it also went on further. They're like, well, but of course I don't think it'll happen, but it would not be appropriate for them to invade Taiwan. So everything about his answer was yes. And also, it's the third time he's made essentially the same statement about Taiwan in public in the same context. So he might have a gaffe once, but 3 gaffes over 6 months is not a gaffe. That's like a policy, right? But what's weird now is that the White House keeps walking it back. And this time it was really hard. They said, well, the policy has not changed. And so the only way to read that is, and they said, well, because he's just saying we'll send them weapons. But that just can't be the right answer given the question and the contrast with the Ukraine policy. So what's going on here is a little bit, it looks like he's changing the policy, but his administration is not ready to do so, or is not willing to do so. And then he came out later to say, of course, I didn't change the policy, which is even more confusing, right? So now he's saying, and so now he's like reinterpreting the policies. We always said we would defend Taiwan, when that's just not the policy. We've always been very cagey on this very question. So, I think I'll just say one thing about this and then we can jump in. But like, there are 2 types of ambiguity. There's ambiguity as to whether the U.S. would defend Taiwan if it was attacked. And then there's ambiguity as to whether the U.S. thinks Taiwan is part of China, the so-called one China policy. And it could be that today, well, we still have the one China policy, which is sort of like, he could be saying, well, we haven't changed that, right? And he could also be saying, and we didn't change, the U.S. is not in favor of Taiwan independence because it would cause war, so we haven't changed that. But it was always our policy to defend Taiwan if it was attacked. So it could be that he could say we haven't changed it, even though he really has changed it. Because, as I think, Ben, you're right, no president of the United States, or even a White House spokesman, or a State Department official, or a Secretary of State has ever answered that question in that way. They've always added caveats, they've added verbiage to sort of soften it. And then finally, it's just the weirdest thing, the only person who's around who was in government office when Nixon went to China, when the Taiwan Relations Act was passed, when all these events happened, is Joe Biden. He's been to Taiwan, he's been to China, he's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We can't say he doesn't know what this policy is. He should know it. He voted for the Taiwan Relations Act. I mean,
it's not like when Trump accidentally had a conversation with the Taiwanese president during the transition.
Right. And so I just don't believe that. I think he really does think the policy, he's changed the policy, but he may be offering this claim that he's not, that this is what the policy has been all along, which I think is kind of where they're edging toward. But it's a strange situation. I would not have expected this from this president and his administration, which is very professional, very bureaucratic, very much into their policy processes. I mean, you know this better than I do, Ben. This is not Trump, right? This is, you would kind of, and Trump never made a public statement about Taiwan like this. He made lots of private statements, but he never made a public statement that was off the cuff, because probably people yelled at him and said, don't say about Taiwan because it'll screw. But Biden, I guess maybe he's confident, or maybe Ukraine has really changed his thinking about this. But he really, I think it's worth that something really important has changed. And I'll just say one other thing. Members of Congress of both parties want him to change policy, right? The chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a Democrat, has wanted this to change. He's saying, I hope he changes the policy. I hope that's what he meant. It's only the people, there's some people in Congress who aren't in favor of that, but there's actually a lot of support in Congress for changing the policy. There's support among the foreign policy elites, like the chairman, the head of the Council of Foreign Relations, Richard Hofstra. So I think we are heading toward this conclusion, this change. It's just we're doing it in a very strange way.
So you mentioned the support, and then just to note, it is bipartisan support. So it is one of the few issues, at least I will say few issues from a personal perspective, where we do see very clear signaling from both Republicans and Democrats where they want this policy, or there's a lack of hesitation around that policy. But how much of this should be signaling versus temperature taking, just in reference to the support in Congress? Because you'd still, regardless of his position, require Congress to declare war, even if there were actions taken. I mean, I know there's some ways around that, but
that's another big issue. It sounds like a Lawfare article we should write to see whether or not Congress needs to authorize the use of force to defend Taiwan.
It's too bad Congress finally repealed that Eisenhower era authorization for the use of force in Taiwan. They authorized nuclear force.
Yeah, they were like all for it. Well, I'll just say that. I mean, I think that they, it's bipartisan, and that's important because you're right. I think that, it's certainly likely, although I'm not quite sure it would be necessary in all circumstances, for Congress to authorize use of force. And in fact, there has been a bill introduced this year to give a kind of a pre-authorization, right? It's actually been introduced over the last couple Congresses. It's the Taiwan Invasion Prevention Act, or the current version, and both members of both parties have co-sponsored these things. Not a lot, because it's kind of like a blank check to use the force, but there is support across parties. It's kind of amazing, really. I mean, Taiwan is, really, it doesn't draw universal support, but it has pretty broad support in Congress, and so that, I think, means that he's kind of he's only getting criticism for not being tough enough. He's not actually getting a lot of public blowback from members of Congress saying, stop it, you're getting us into war. Instead, what he's getting is complaining from Tom Cotton saying, you should have just said it. Just be clear, right? Or, or even Senator Menendez is like, I hope that's what he means, right? And so maybe he's a more subtle person than I give him credit for, and he is kind of floating this idea so that he can get that opinion. But couldn't he just call them up? I mean, he's the president of the United States. Couldn't he even call them rather than float this in these public? And because the problem with this is that he's confusing the hell out of the Chinese, which might be good, right? But it could also be dangerous.
So I wanna talk about that, because it seems to me there's two. Given that it's Biden, you have to consider the possibility that it's an impulsive logorrheal thing. And, that this isn't the White House staff rebelling against the policy dictates of the president. It's actually the president having said something that he really didn't mean to say. I think, given that it's, as you point out, take number 3, and he said that essentially the same thing in stronger terms, it's kind of hard to believe it's that. So I want to lay out a theory of what it is and have you respond to it. So 3 months ago, everyone was saying the Russians are going to take Kiev in 3 days, and they're going to decapitate the Zelensky government. They're going to install a puppet regime, that they're going to turn Ukraine into Belarus, and we're not going to be able to do anything about it. And the Chinese are going to take that as a green light on Taiwan. The fact that the United States and the West is sort of impotent in its response to this they're going to take it as a green light. And we're in a very, very dangerous situation. And a lot of people, frankly, including me, believed that. So now, 3 months in, the Russians are being humiliated. The West looks very competent, um, and quite determined. The things that the countries are fighting about are, whether the oil embargo will be immediate and total, or whether it will have an exception for Hungary for some period of time, right? I mean, we're talking about whether the yachts that are being seized will be ever given back, or whether they'll be used,
Right.
to house Ukrainians. And the Russian military offensive has been somewhere between a disaster and a cosmic disaster. And so Biden looks at this situation and says, for exactly the same reason it was uh, dangerous, this situation was dangerous 3 months ago, now is a great time to signal to the Chinese, don't test us. And so, presented with a question that that allows him to be forward leaning and say, essentially, to Xi, you see what we're doing over there to the Russians, we can fuck you up real bad too. He takes the opportunity. Um, and that the messaging is actually quite deliberate, and it's an attempt to accentuate the messaging with respect to Ukraine. What do you think?
So I thought about this. I mean, I do agree, for instance, that China, that what's going on in Ukraine, and for, I think, a lot of us, surprising ability of Ukraine to resist and now humiliate Russia, is having a huge impact on Chinese thinking about the West, about Russia, about the United States and its relative strength, I think. And also, the other thing that's happened in the last few months that is going on, which is worth noting, is China's been going under this crazy COVID lockdown struggle that's really killing their economy and causing a lot of internal domestic problems that are front and center for the Chinese leadership, and is really dominating, is almost as big a story. I mean, foreign businesses for the first time really getting nervous about China. So that I think, and so Biden, I think, could imagine himself saying, hey, we're kind of in a relatively strong position, a stronger one than I would have imagined 3 months ago. Let's make sure she knows that, we don't, we want to be tough here, and don't mess with Taiwan. I think that would be a good stretch. I just don't understand why he's doing it in this way. He just seems like this. Oh, are we?
Doesn't China? Oh, no, he'll be back. Doesn't China also have that very large meeting internally coming up
and they
at
have
the end
what
of
the
the year?
equivalent of their every 5 years they have an election. It's the Communist Party Congress, but since that's really the way they run the country, it's their real election. It's the real, like, political fight. So it's whether he gets another 5 years. I think he's going to get it, but the question is under what terms. So it's a very politically sensitive year. So I think that so it's not so much, I don't disagree with the policy. I don't disagree the US and the West have an advantage now they didn't have, and they should press it on China, especially given China's domestic weakness, problems right now, and its sensitivity. What I object to, or at least I'm confused by, is the method or the manner, like the random comments that get walked back, or that get sort of reported in this kind of confusing way, and then that it's just not clear. No one's quite sure exactly if that's what he did, or maybe he's just floating it, or it just doesn't seem like it gives it a lot of clarity. I'd rather have him just call up President Xi, who he can get on the phone. He's the president of the United States. He can get them on the phone and just tell them, look, we have you guys on the ropes. Look what we've done to Russia. stay away from Taiwan. And then he doesn't have to humiliate the Chinese in public, which they hate, right?
Mhm.
Or force them into showing some toughness that they're going to send more jets to circle Taiwan. They're going to send out the Navy. It just
Didn't they
seems
have
like
like
why?
150 air warplanes like in the air in like the
Yeah,
past month alone?
yeah, they've been kind of going up and down, but that's usually how they show the displeasure. They'll send in bombers or fighter jets, not into Taiwanese airspace, but kind of around their defense identification zone, just to let them know and remind them that, hey, we could at any moment here overwhelm you with air power. And I guess, and they're going to do that because they can't be. If you humiliate them publicly, they're going to have to show that they are doing something about it, especially in a political year where, even if the general public doesn't care, which I don't think they care that much right now, the people in the party, party Congress, the members of the Communist Party are going to care. And so I don't like this method. I don't, and also it confuses us on our side. Like, I don't, some people some people are like, well, maybe he's finally losing it, or maybe maybe there's internal dissension in the United States administration. Which is possible too. So I
mean, there's
don't object.
clearly internal dissension in the sense that the president said one thing and then the White House raced to
Right.
clarify that he didn't
But
say it.
usually it's like the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. It's not usually the president versus the National Security Advisor. I mean, that seems odd. Like, I teach constitutional law. That's not how it's supposed to work. He's supposed to be in charge, but
Well, he's supposed to be in charge of the Secretary of Defense and State
Right.
too.
Right, fair enough. But I just feel like it's so I don't object to the shift. I think I've thought about this, but I think it's the right thing to do, especially after Ukraine, because I think if we don't do it now, when we're going to do it, this is a good time to signal China, come back to the negotiating table. If you want Taiwan, you're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way. You're going to have to get them to vote, or at least agree to this in some meaningful democratic way, which has sort of been our policy, and then stand down. And I think this is the time to do it. I don't approve of this way of doing it. I don't think, and I'm surprised that. I mean, I'm not a Washington person, but it seems like a strange way to do this. It's maybe the very American way of doing it, and so and I think but I just think it's a strange and odd way, and possibly self-defeating way to do it.
Okay, so I want to push you on that and figure out a few possible defenses of this way to do it. But GDF, you first.
So my question is really like, you made the point that he has a direct line to Xi Jinping. And so is it to other individuals in the party who could perhaps need to have a show of strength, or perhaps the communication has been, I need posturing in this manner in order to have a certain sensibility about the situation? Because I mean, I believe China's called for reunification forever. So it's something that's very deep in the national identity. And I'm pleased, I'd love to hear your response to that thought.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are a lot of constituencies who would want to hear this in public, and I think it would be helpful. And, one, the Taiwanese public, the polls show that they don't believe. After Ukraine, the one reaction they've had is that, well, they're not going to defend Ukraine, then they're not going to defend, America's not going to defend us. And so he could be trying to signal to them that the U.S. is still with you. Although, again, I'm not sure this is, the reporting in Taiwan is pretty sophisticated. They're all pretty confused about this too. But yeah, so there's that. And then I think there's also other elites within China. Maybe you need to signal to them, hey, we mean business. And I guess that's possible, although it's just as likely that it'll set off some rogue faction of the army that's like, wait a minute, this is, we better act then, because, we've always said that if the US, intervened, we would defend Taiwan. And so, or not, we would reunify Taiwan. So I think it's just risky. I think you're right. We could be signaling the other folks in China, but I don't know which way that goes. It could go in a bad direction for us.
Okay, so I want to try to, again, on the assumption that this was a deliberate thing, not a flub, which may be wrong, but if it's a flub, if it's flub, it requires no explanation beyond that. So that's theory number one. But let me pose that this is the equivalent of a trial balloon. That you have the president say it. It's clear that he said it. You have the White House kind of deny that he said it, And then you have an Oceania is at war with East Asia. Oceania was always at war with East Asia. We would always defend Taiwan. That's always
Right.
been the policy, which is
Right.
simply false
Right.
statement. And maybe this is a way of testing the water of the Chinese reaction to see, do they go ballistic about it, or does it land kind of the way Finland joining NATO lands, which is, Putin says, oh, there's going to be a war, there are going to be consequences. And then, like it's a little bit more expensive to run a sauna in Finland than it was before the NATO application. And that's the consequences. So you get a way to sort of test it in a fashion that allows you to back down without without reversing policy if the Chinese reaction is such that you feel like you really need to. On the other hand, if the world doesn't end when you've announced that actually our policy has always been that we would defend Taiwan, then you've effectively changed the policy and you can just keep reiterating that.
Yeah. No,
So,
I like this.
what do you think?
I like this idea. It's very again, it would be kind of like the kind of six-dimensional chess that we always thought that people always hoped that was going on in the Trump administration. That seems unlikely that was happening, but maybe this would actually be that, because there's a lot of levels of I mean, this, like I said, is there ever really been a doctrine like this where we've kind of floated an important decades old doctrine that we've kind of backed into this way? I don't know. I have to think about this as historical analogies. But I do like the idea. I mean, I do like the idea of annoying and confusing the Chinese leadership and putting them off balance, because I think it's too often that we're reacting to what they do, but they should be just as scared of us as we are of them. And I think they probably are. We just can't. Their press doesn't reflect that. Whereas we have the press that is, we crush each other all the time. So there's that. On the other hand, and I think that, like, backing into this, it turns out we always would have defended Taiwan against there's ways you can get to there, right? So it turns out we would always defend Taiwan in the situation of an unprovoked attack, such as if, like Russia and Ukraine, but we wouldn't defend Taiwan in some other circumstances, but that's not relevant here. And that's what I was really saying. And that was our policy all along, right? And I think this is a defensible. I still think might be a little too subtle, maybe, for the Chinese, because I think the problem is that you want them to, you provoke them, and you could be saying, okay, we're calling their bluff. It turns out they don't really, they're not really willing to go to the mat over this kind of commitment over Taiwan. This is not a casus belli. And I suppose that is, and that would be valuable to know. But the problem is, if it's still confusing enough that they have deniability, they say, well, actually, that's not really their policy, then they can always say, well, you haven't really shifted your policy, so therefore we don't have to show you what we would do otherwise. So they still have deniability as well, I think. But I do like, this is a tantalizing idea. It's kind of like trying to troll the Chinese leadership a little, right? And try to get them to show us what they would do and call their bluff, because they are willing to make these incredibly bellicose statements, but not willing to do anything about it. Maybe it turns out that it's not that, that they're kind of a paper tiger. I just feel a little bit nervous about doing that, given what's at stake here. And I think you might. I don't know that they're quite as sort of organized, and we can imagine they could be misreading our signals as well, I think. So I still think it would be better just to go straight at them and tell them, and don't humiliate them in public. One thing I'll just say on this, though, is the China expert class has always said, that China is, this is the most, third rail. Taiwan is the most third rail. And, I think maybe this will be what's going on in America is actually more important, that it's no longer the third rail to talk about Taiwan, defending Taiwan and Taiwan independence in Congress or in the Washington sort of journalistic space. I mean, that's a big shift for us. And, maybe that's what Biden is also trying to shape the blob a little bit to make it more sort of, more open to where he eventually wants to go.
Okay, so one other possibility, which is that the fallback position that the White House has landed on is actually true, and that there has been for a long time since the Carter administration an understanding that we would, in fact, defend Taiwan. And the only difference between current policy and past policy is that Biden is now saying it. So when he says this has always been our policy, what he actually means is that the unspoken policy, it's like when the Israelis have strategic ambiguity about whether they have nuclear weapons. Everybody knows they have nuclear weapons,
Right.
right?
We don't want to admit it publicly.
There's no strategic ambiguity at all. They just can't join the NPT as a nuclear weapon state, and they're not going to join as a non-nuclear weapon state. And so what he's actually doing is announcing, in fact, what has always been an unspoken, at least publicly unspoken, U.S. policy. But he's not wrong that there has been for a long time, at least at the Defense Department, an understanding that that Taiwan is a red line for us as well. What do you think?
So I think this is a possibility because of the way Biden keeps saying that's a commitment we made. He said this twice, and in each of the comments he said, would we defend Taiwan? And he says that's the commitment we've made as a past tense, which makes me think, oh, you mean there's some sort of secret promise that every American president has made, or every administration has made. But that just, we just never said it out loud. But I guess I would have thought that if we had that kind of sort of discipline among our presidents, that this was our unspoken policy. I just feel like that would have been better understood outside of sort of the administration. I think my own guess is that it was, the Pentagon was always like, we're assuming that we would do this but we would have to get the red light from the administration. So we're planning for it. But I don't think that there was ever a public commitment. And let me explain to you why I think that understanding has always been ambiguous. Because it's not just China that we're trying to keep off balance. The original reason for strategic ambiguity was not just to confuse China, it's to confuse Taipei. It's to keep the government in Taiwan from getting reckless and from declaring independence or doing something. Or in the old days, we were actually worried that the Taiwanese would try to retake the mainland, right? And so we needed to keep them from crossing that way, right? So the ambiguity was designed to.
That's a policy I support, by the way. I think would be like the ultimate, Taiwan one-ups Ukraine.
Right.
Ukraine takes out Russia, but watch us, guys.
Yeah, well, I mean, it reminds me of, I always think somehow we're living through Hunger Games, which I don't know if you guys ever watched this, and Taiwan has become District 13. If you've ever seen Hunger Games, they're under this horrendous, like, totalitarian regime, but there's one district that holds out in secret. It's called District 13. And then eventually they come and take back the entire country. And, I always wonder why we haven't made more of this weird analogy, that the whole Hunger Games is really about China, it turns out. But this is why I'll never get a visa to go back to China if I keep talking like this. But I think that, I think that the problem with this sort of, that we always have commitments, I don't think we did. I think we didn't want to give the Taiwanese, we didn't trust them, and for good reason, because in the 2000s under Bush had terrible relations with the Taiwanese president, who was very pro-independence, and I think he had to scare them off. He originally was very pro-Taiwan. By the end of the administration, he wasn't even talking to the Taiwan president, and was like, "Get this guy out of here," right? Like, and he thought that guy was reckless. That guy would start a war by declaring independence and all these other things. So, I don't think we've had, and I think it's because we've been afraid what Taiwan would do if we gave them that blank check.
And didn't that guy end up going to prison for life for corruption?
He not for life, but yes, for corruption, and yes, and although they let him out under medical humanitarian grounds, but yes.
So yeah. Bush wasn't wholly wrong about him.
No, he wasn't. No, but I don't think Bush. Right, Bush was not wrong about him. And the guy was reckless, and he could have started. I think, and Bush was like, "I have this war on terrorism thing. Don't start this thing in China, right? I'm busy, right? Leave me alone. We have Iraq, right? We don't have time for this." So I can see why that is the case, but I think I'm saying that's sort of been, the U.S. policy has veered between trying to push the Taiwanese make up with China, to keep things calm at the very least. And so that's why it is a little dangerous, because there are very radical pro-independence people in Taiwan who might win the next election, who could be emboldened to say, look, we're just going to do this. Biden said he'll come protect us. We're going to declare independence and let's see what happens, right? And maybe it'll all work out, but it's very dangerous as well. So that's why I'm a little nervous about going down this road. I know right now the current administration and the Trump administration really trust the current Taiwanese government because they're pretty cautious. They're pretty down the middle on these issues. But her term ends in 2024. And I think the politics of Taiwan suggests that they're probably going to go more toward independence, not less. And so this could be something that could be a problem, where we are giving them a blank check to declare independence, which maybe that's our policy, but I don't know that these sorts of troublings are the good way to test that. I mean, maybe so, but maybe I'm just becoming too kind of process oriented in my old age here, where I'm like, there's a way to do this, and you're not doing it the right way. Like this, it seems like a strange way to do this. But that's why I'm a little worried about what this is doing to the Taiwanese, and emboldening, I think, what might be a pro-independence, a radical pro-independence group that could provoke China. Because there is a line, and that's one thing I did learn from living in China, is that there's a line where you don't want to humiliate them. But so that the great thing about Taiwan is that they're effectively independent, right? And then they can do what they want. But as long as you don't admit that you're independent, everyone feels okay. Everyone's happy, right? You don't lose face in the classic Asian analysis, right? But it actually has some truth to that. It's publicly humiliating them, the leadership, is dangerous, and we don't know how to respond. Especially the current leader seems to be kind of not well communicating with people, a little out of touch. I just think it's a little scary, and that's why presidents have traditionally not messed with this. Now, I'll just say one last thing on this side. Maybe things have shifted so much that Biden is feeling really confident, and he knows something we don't about how weak China is, and this is the moment to push them. But I don't know. Maybe that's what's going on. I hope so.
Yeah, I mean, my hypothesis is Biden sees or thinks he sees. I mean, he's made some catastrophically wrong judgments, and so I don't want to attribute to him vision that may be not there. But one possibility is he sees an advantage. He's trying to press that advantage with plausible deniability, and he has reason to think the Chinese military is that the experience of the Russian military in Ukraine has given the Chinese leadership a lot to think about in terms of how the Chinese military would perform against the US military, which is, for our sins, is extremely battle tested over the last, 40 years. And we know how the United States military would perform. We don't know how their military would perform, and they don't know how their military would perform. And he's rubbing their noses in that a little bit and saying, you know, you know, but trying to do it in a way that allows Jake Sullivan to say he's not really saying it.
Okay, I guess, I mean, it does seem like that's the most charitable interpretation of the events, given the characters involved. Maybe that's when I'm not sure I'm behind this approach.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I believe that's what's happening, and I'm
Yeah.
not sure it's wise if it is.
Yeah, that could
I'm
be.
Again, I think it's perfectly possible Biden, who is the second most inarticulate president of the last two, which is to say pretty damn inarticulate, but not, he just got caught flat-footed, and he had an emotional reaction that wasn't too well considered.
Can I just say
Daniel,
one thing
yeah,
before
please.
just on, I do think I just don't think that's the case, because this is the third time. He's just not that, can't be emotional all the time, right? And then finally, but I would say that, and I think that this is why it's important, because I think we are kind of, given where Congress is, given where Russia is, given where America is at this moment, I think we probably are shifting. I think whether or not Biden does it this way or some other way, we are going to shift to some sort of public understanding that the U.S. will, defend Taiwan if it's attacked in the way Russia attacked Ukraine. I think that we're getting there, and I think that's that ultimately that's a better policy for Taiwan, the U.S. I don't like the way we're getting there. That's all.
Fair enough. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Is it okay if I switch my question, given that it's largely been answered?
It is okay. You will be forgiven for switching your question.
So I am curious, relative to your concern about nuclear escalation between Russia and Ukraine, where would your concern about nuclear escalation be if China invaded Taiwan and the US militarily intervened in some capacity or another?
This is it's a good question. I mean, China has a no first use nuke policy, and they've generally been unwilling to ever rattle the saber on the nuke saber, even over Taiwan. So I think whereas so compared to Russia, I would say it's generally speaking less. Also, they have a very small nuclear force relative to Russia, and to the extent that matters, and they don't have like the same kind of capabilities that Russia has either. So I would say it's less, but not zero. Because I think on the other hand, although I don't know Russia, Ukraine very well, and there is a real deep, as I think Genevieve said, long-standing passion or obsession with Taiwan that could push people to the edge in a way that maybe Russia and Ukraine doesn't. Although it turns out there are some Russians who have similar feelings about Ukraine. So maybe it is an apt comparison. But in terms of China's capability, it's not as much as Russia. And their general approach to nukes has been actually never to use it in that way, to rattle sabers, even over Taiwan. Not never, but almost never.
That's interesting. It's also much less clear if you were China and the battlefield and the goal was to take Taiwan, what you would nuke, than it is if you're Russia and you're fighting over
Right. They don't have a doctrine
Ukraine.
Right. As far as I'm aware, they don't have the capability or doctrine to use tactical nukes, which the Russians have been thinking about. And again, also, it would be odd for them to nuke Taiwan, which is part of the motherland, right? I mean, it's right. Again, I guess Ukraine is too, but still, and it's a much, it doesn't, and whatever's valuable about it is not going to, so it's just not, it's not the right weapon.
They're also, when you hear the Russians, the Russian discussion of tactical nukes is also often very theatrical, blow up a nuke over the Black Sea, for demonstration purposes, but there's just not a lot of empty space in Taiwan.
Right. Well, but I would say the target's not Taiwan. What I would be worried about would be that they would threaten Japan and the bases in Japan. And I think that would be the right strategy for them. The problem for that would be, and the Japanese are aware of this, and so that's why the Japanese are like, maybe we should get some nukes too, I think, right? So I mean, I think this is the real danger, that they'll use the nukes on Guam, on U.S. bases, and I don't think they use it on Taiwan. I think they would be used to hit foreign forces.
Which makes Biden's statement even more interesting that he was in Japan when he said it.
Well, actually, that's underreported. The Japanese are really worried about Taiwan because it's much closer to them than to us. And he actually said something like, and not only, he almost made it sound like, and we all agree, including Japan, that this is what we would do, which I don't think Japan has signed up for that, at least not yet.
Although they didn't contradict him.
No, and they didn't jump out and scream about it. So, and the former Japanese Prime Minister, Abe, has published an op-ed in the LA Times recently calling for the U.S. to say they would defend Taiwan and publicly. So he's actually, Japan has really shifted dramatically on this. And the one thing the Biden administration can really take credit for that the Trump on China policy that the Trump administration can't, maybe not the one thing, but one of the things they can take credit for is that they really internationalized Taiwan. They've gone to Europe and said, we want you to talk about Taiwan, and they have. They've gone to Japan and said, we want you to talk about Taiwan. The G7, we want you to talk about Taiwan. We want to say how peace in Taiwan is important. And that's, I think that makes a difference. I mean, the Germans are signed on, that it's not just a US, China, Taiwan story anymore. Now Japan, Australia, the G7,
the Quad.
the Quad yet, but getting close, right? And India is getting closer on this, and so that's actually going to a nice success that was not something that Trump couldn't really do, even though I think his administration wanted to.
Dr. Doom, the floor is yours.
Oh, thanks. Chips are now kind of a strategic commodity. How much does the policy depend on the concentration of the fabrication stuff in Taiwan? And if it's migrated out, what kind of changes in policy would you expect?
Yeah, that's a great question. The chip thing is kind of weird. That how hard could it be that only one country could do this, and why is it Taiwan of all the places, right? It's but it turns out it's really hard to build these high-end chip facilities that, and so it would take I think people always say it would take 5 to 10 years to build it out in a way that would be equivalent to what they have now. So we're talking a little bit of a long term.
Just for those of you who don't know, basically every semiconductor chip in the world is made in Taiwan.
Well, the ones of the highest,
the highest caliber.
Right.
But also a huge percentage of the commodified ones are Taiwanese now too.
Yeah, I mean, it really is astonishing. And just some guy from Taiwan who went to grad school in the States and said, "Oh, I'll just call it this." I don't know what happened, and then all of a sudden he created this. So I think Taiwan has strategic importance even outside the chip thing. But the chip thing has sort of helped focus everyone's attention on what Taiwan has to offer besides just being a strategic location, because I think the military has long said that Taiwan's really important just as a geographic location, because the whole first island chain idea, Taiwan's in the middle of this idea of between Japan and the Philippines. With Taiwan there, then the Chinese Navy has to traverse various obstacles to get out to the open sea. So this would be a valuable location to maintain that's not part of China. So the chip thing, I think, would reduce the, and I think the chip thing also is one of the reasons why the Europeans, I think, are more sensitive to Taiwan than they would have been in the past, because the Europeans are even more dependent on chips, because they don't have any capacity really in the same way. Even the U.S. is more than they do. So it's a valuable thing, and it's accidental. But I would just say that Taiwan, even before the chip phenomenon, has a lot of strategic importance in strategy planning. And Japan doesn't care about the chips. Japan cares about this would be, they think of it now, at least the current Japanese government thinks of it as a real threat to Japan's territorial integrity. Like to have the Chinese sitting in Taiwan 100, and ready to hit Okinawa, it's only a couple hundred miles away. That's something that the Japanese are worried about.
Itamar, you have an elephant on your shirt, and the floor is yours.
I noticed that you have no animal on your shirt.
Genevieve is carrying the dog shirt banner today. I'm at the Brookings Institution, where it is traditionally frowned upon to wear dog shirts. I sometimes wear a dog shirt to the Brookings Institution, but not today.
Fair enough. So I guess you kind of touched on my first question, or well, you basically covered it, which was the strategic importance of Taiwan. So I'll jump to my second/third, if that's all right. Which is first, there's been kind of a lot of reporting upon like the Taiwanese military resolve, as to like a lot of people have saying the Taiwanese military isn't particularly popular for historical reasons, and so it's like unclear how willing they would be to fight. So I'm curious what your take is on that. And the other question is, what was the initial reasoning for strategic ambiguity, and do those reasons still apply? If not, when did they stop applying?
Okay, so yeah, let me just quickly on the military. I think you're right that the Taiwanese military, we call it Taiwanese military, but it's the Republic of China military, and in Chinese they call it the national military, which is referring not just the nation, but it's the nation of China. And
isn't it also a reference to the Nationalist Party?
And it's also a reference to the Nationalist Party, which was the governing party until the dominant governing party in China and then Taiwan. And so they kind of ran the army kind of like the way the Communist Party runs the People's Liberation Army and as sort of like a political fiefdom. And so it was very unpopular. And among the local Taiwanese who were conscripted into it, now I should say my dad, who is an old KMT guy, served in that army and assures me that it was always a crap army, even in the 50s and 60s. And, you know, when he was stationed, he's like, well, I'm just going to die when the Chinese come, but well, we'll be here anyway. So they just didn't, there's not a lot of confidence. There's never been a lot of confidence. They got crushed in China by the communists without much, even though the US government was giving them $1 billion a year. And so it just doesn't have a glorious institutional history. They never took on the Japanese when they were fighting them in an effective way. So it's an army with no tradition of glory at all. And then in Taiwan, it's even worse because they're seen as outsiders and affiliated with the party that's currently out of power and out of step, I think, with a lot of Taiwanese nationalist types today. So having said all that, the army, I think the military is an important institution in Taiwan. And, you know, there's the Ukraine thing has really triggered, and even before that, there's been a rethink of the military, and that the military in Taiwan is being seen as, you know, something that they need to improve. I mean, I think it's a real problem though, and I think it's one of the biggest differences with Ukraine and Taiwan is that the Taiwanese army is has lots of fancy weapons, but they don't have the confidence or the training or the tradition or the history to be an effective fighting force, and there's no reason to think they would be, frankly. I mean,
on the other hand, they don't have a gazillion-mile land border with Russia and Ukraine to defend. I mean, you know, it's pretty hard to invade an island.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why they never really invested much. But so and what they should have done, what they did was invest in the Air Force and air defense, and also submarines. They're building their own. Taiwan's developing their own submarines, because submarines obviously are important for their defense. And so they should do more of that. And there's only so much you can do with their Navy. So that's something that they should do. And the Taiwanese military is a sore point because the Taiwanese don't spend that much money on the military, right? As a percentage of GDP. And if you were facing an existential threat from an invading Chinese army, you would think that you would have to spend a little bit more than they do currently on the military. Only in recent years have they even started to spend 2% of their GDP. So this is not a country that's super motivated.
Astonishing.
Yeah. This is not a country, and this is part of the reason why, and to get to the second question, which I'm sorry I didn't get to, ambiguity. You don't want to give the Taiwanese too much comfort, because then they'll be like, let's just be, you know, let's not spend money, the US will come save us anyways, right? Or, you know, we could do whatever we want, the US will come save us anyways. That was always a concern as well. And so ambiguity was designed for two reasons. One, to keep the Chinese guessing as to what we would do without provoking them, but also to keep the Taiwanese guessing as what we would do and not provoke them to do something rash or get complacent. And that's why there has served some purposes here. And if we abandon, when we abandon it, or as I think we will, it will have some costs. But I think there's more confidence, I think, we have in the Taiwanese government that they're not going to go off the reservation. That's one reason why it's okay to abandon that side of the ambiguity. And I think the other side is that there's not much benefit in keeping the Chinese guessing, because I think they've been so radical and dangerous with Hong Kong and other places that there's no reason to think that it's going to necessarily, you know, they're going to want to take Taiwan anyways, whatever we say. So let's just be clear about it. Say we'll defend it, because there's not much ambiguity benefit on that side of the ledger anymore.
John Hawkinson, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ben. So I just want to understand better how we think about secret policy versus actual publicly disseminated policy. And that's both with respect to the yes as a potential gaffe. Is it a gaffe by disclosing what was really the internal policy, but just was never public? Or is it, you know, just at a deeper level?
That's a good question. I don't think the U.S. has been very successful at having secret agreements and secret policies. I think other countries do. One thing is that our White Houses leak like sieves, right? And if they don't leak, people write their memoirs afterwards, right? You know, and so I mean, I think that, but maybe Ben or Genevieve, you guys have a different view of this, but I don't think we have that many secret policies. We had something, for instance, in the Taiwan context, where the U.S. gave some secret assurances to Taiwan in 1982 after we had told China that we would draw down our military sales. We would sort of eventually phase out military sales to Taiwan. We sort of said that to China in a communique in 1982. And then we secretly sent a letter to Reagan sent a letter to China saying, actually, to Taiwan saying, actually, we'll give you 6 assurances, and one of them will be, we won't stop selling you weapons to defend yourself. But that was like pretty much public immediately, even though it was a secret, and they didn't officially release it until a few years ago. So there are examples of that, but I don't think we have that many secret policies, and we certainly don't have many secret agreements, I guess. So, I mean, I on the Taiwan thing, you would imagine that there have been secret assurances, but I actually think a lot of it's been mostly public, and we are kind of where we are. There's not much secret stuff going on, but I'm a little naive here, and I don't have the. I just, knowing what I know, the people who served in all these administrations, the idea that they could keep it a secret over all this time, it seems not high to me, right? Especially the last, and so that seems unlikely to me because of the incentives of America to go out and tell you how important you are and stuff like that. So, but maybe I'm wrong. But.
I tend to agree with that. All right, we have time for 2 more questions. We have 2 more questioners on the screen. We're going to get through them both. Matteo.
Thanks. My question derives from like the fact that we're even spending so much time talking about this right now, because it occurs to me that since we're trying so hard to interpret what Biden's statements mean, at least from my perspective, ambiguity remains in place. And so, like, is that naive? Is that like too simplistic? Or is it fair to say that strategic ambiguity is functionally still what's going on?
Let's quickly.
Well,
I actually
can I just say on that?
Yeah.
The United States could not now fail to defend Taiwan without the president having broken his word.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you that I've been calling this an ambiguous strategic ambiguity like policy, but I do think that we're much closer to and almost all the way to clarity at this point, and so that's why it's still worth talking about. I agree with you that we're not all the way. I don't think we're all the way there yet, but we're like 90% of the way there, and to getting to departing from that part of strategic ambiguity. So I think it's still worth talking about. I just, like I said, I don't like the way he's done it.
A concerned citizen. Your concerns get the last question today.
Hi, thanks for another great episode. What is your take on the question of whether Xi Jinping has made China an autocracy? And if your answer is in the affirmative, what are some of the most significant consequences of this? Thanks.
Well, I guess I would just say China was already kind of an autocracy. Not kind of, it already was an autocracy before Xi Jinping. But I think that it's fair to say he's made it much more autocratic. It was kind of like, it's a big country, it's hard to control, right? There's lots of different interest groups you have to manage. And he's managed to crush a lot of his opposition among factions within the Chinese Communist Party. That's the best analysis I've seen of the internal dynamics. And that's one of the reasons why China is more dangerous today than it was 10 years ago, because of the centralization of power with Xi Jinping, and bringing back really something much closer to, people say, much closer to Mao, where Mao had this personalized kind of control. And there are elements of this where you have to read the Xi Jinping like thought books, and actually they have an app on your phone, so you take the test, the quiz, and you get the points, and then you get like certain like benefits if you're a party member. So they've kind of updated it for the modern era, but still, like, it's kind of eerie. Like there's Xi Jinping thought on every subject, and everyone's got to study it, spit it out, make sure they know it. So that's not good. I mean, everything we know about personalized autocratic rule is not good from our history, for at least those of us both in and out of that country. And
plus the dude's banned Winnie the Pooh. I can't forgive that.
A lot of things have happened, and I just think that's I think the domestic scene in China is much worse, much more, and that actually makes it more dangerous for everyone else out here as well, because it makes it more risky. We've seen this element in Hong Kong. We see the types of stuff they're doing in Xinjiang. There would not have been the same ability to control or mobilize China in the same way before Xi Jinping. And so I think that's why. So even though China ultimately comes out weaker from all this, I think they do economically weaker. They're also in some ways more dangerous because they're more politically unified under a personalized rule. So I think that's why I'm scared. That's why one of the reasons why I'm more willing to shift to strategic clarity, because I don't think there's much we can do to deter Xi Jinping by, at this point, given what we know of him and the way he rolls and the way he treated Hong Kong and the way he's been treating Xinjiang and the way he's been beating up on Tibet and the way he's acting in South China Sea. There's no signals of like, oh, if we only just let him alone, everything will be okay. There's no reason to think that's true. And that might have been true with his predecessors, although people might argue about that as well.
Well, and the lesson for if Ukraine has any broad lessons, which it surely does, certainly one of them is that clarity in U.S. leadership is really valuable. That I don't believe for a second that the degree of unity that the West has been able to have about this would have been possible without the degree of intelligence transparency that the administration engaged in before the war, had it not been so clear about what was going to happen and what the consequences were going to be. And applying that same logic to this would argue for exactly the kind of clarity that you're describing, not for this kind of head fakes in various directions and keep Xi guessing.
Yeah, no, that's right. So I'm waiting for that boring policy speech, at graduation or something, where he can just lay it all out for everyone, and we can just.
Congratulations, graduates of the University of Southern North Dakota. Consider this a formal statement of administration policy that you should all go to graduate school and have wonderful careers, and thank your parents. And by the way, it is now U.S. policy that we will defend Taiwan against an unprovoked attack, but will not aid it in reconquering the mainland. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Chancellor so-and-so.
Yeah, let's do this. You and I can do this together, Ben, in 5 minutes.
All right. Julian Ku, you're a great American. We are going to leave it there. We will be back on Friday. Kate, by that time, will have finished moving. I hear she's already finished moving. She's going to be back. I have no idea who the guest is going to be, but, we'll figure it out between now and then. And until then, GDF?
We don't have fun anymore, but in lieu of fun, we have some ambiguity about many things, but no ambiguity about how everyone should go to Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to your podcast and rate and
thank you, GDF.
And
I just want to point out, by the way, that GDF just hosted a whole show bouncing up and down the entire time.
Sorry about that.
And Luke was an angel. He fell asleep. And, let it not be said that that you cannot host a show with a baby on your back, because you have now seen it done. We'll be back next time.
Okay. All right. See ya.